Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Vazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I have Rene Almeling on today's show, and she's Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale University. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit more about her, but before I do, I want to welcome her. Welcome, Rene.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
And I hear sweet birds in the background, and I love it. What are those birds doing over there?
So I have a tiny little patio outside my office, and it's springtime here, so they are actually trying to make little bird babies.
They knew that we were going to talk today, apparently. So let me tell our audience a little bit more about you. So as I said, you're Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale University with research and teaching interests in gender and medicine. Using a range of qualitative, historical, and quantitative methods, you examine questions about how biological bodies and cultural norms interact to influence scientific knowledge, medical markets, and individual experiences. You're the author of Sex Cells, C-E-L-L-S. You guys will hyperlink the book on the transcript that goes with this interview, an award-winning book that offers an inside look at the American market for egg donors and sperm donors. And your new book, GUYnecology, G-U-Y, examines why there's so little attention to men's reproductive health and analyzes how this gap affects medical knowledge, health policy, and reproductive politics. Professor Almeling has also conducted 2 original surveys, the first on Americans' attitudes toward genetic risk with political scientist Shanna Kushner Gadarian, and the other on women's bodily experiences when it comes to IVF. Welcome again, Rene. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like the birds are tuning in because they're not chirping anymore, and I kind of miss that. So I guess the first question that I would love to ask you is what drew you to this topic, into digging into biology, cultural norms, and history?
Yeah, well, the answer to that question goes back quite a long way. So way back in college, I was taking a class on the sociology of gender, and my professor had assigned an article about the Baby M surrogacy trial from 1987. And I have no idea what it was, as I was a 19-year-old kid taking this class, and I just became completely fascinated by the idea that a woman could be paid to carry a pregnancy, and questions about how does that make the pregnancy feel? Does it feel different to be gestating a fetus that you're not genetically related to, that you have no plans to parent? And so some of those early questions about the intersection of medical technology and bodily experiences and cultural ideas about gender really were sort of, born or conceived in that long ago class. And so after that, I spent a couple of years working in Washington, D.C. at a women's health nonprofit, and then I went to graduate school where I began studying egg and sperm donation. That was that first book, and all my books, I do apologize, you do have to spell out the titles to really get the puns. So that's, and ever since then, I've been sort of in the world of reproduction and medicine and technologies.
That's great. And GUYnecology, your new book, looks at the history of the study of men's reproductive health. Why are there specialties for women's reproductive health, but not necessarily a male equivalent?
Yeah, that was really the animating question for this most recent book. Why do we have OBGYN? Why do we have women going in every couple of years to have their reproductive organs examined, and there's no equivalent medical specialty or medical recommendations for men? So the answer, to try to figure out the answer to that question really brought me into the world of the history of medicine. You have to sort of go back a ways to figure out how do we get the medical specialties that we have today. And I ended up finding out that, the answer was really rooted at the end of the 19th century. So more than 100 years ago, as the medical profession in the United States began to professionalize, to become a profession, and to specialize, OB, obstetrics, and gynecology were some of the earliest and quickly institutionalized specialties. They formally merged in the 1920s and 30s, and so that's why we have OB-GYN today. But at the time, in the 1880s, 1890s, there was actually an attempt to launch a parallel specialty to GYN for men called andrology. And it was a group of physicians in New York City. Many of them were medical professors at the the early medical colleges. And they made the argument that we need a specialty for men's reproductive bodies the way we have for women. The problem was, at the time, at the end of the 19th century, most of what was wrong with men's reproductive bodies was venereal disease, to use the language of the time. So today we call them sexually transmitted infections, but syphilis, gonorrhea were just absolutely epidemic. So these doctors were basically trying to specialize in something that was seen as deeply immoral and problematic, and they get laughed out of the pages of medical journals. So that early attempt to launch andrology just quickly, completely flames out. And about 80 years passes until another group of physicians in the 1960s says, hey, what about a specialty parallel to GYN for men? Why don't we call it andrology? And they had no idea that they were not the first ones to think of this. It was a different time, 1960s versus 1880s. So at the 1960s, 1970s, you have the sort of social movements around gender and patients' rights, men's rights. And so all the sort of social kind of upheaval at the time made it at least thinkable to have a specialty devoted to men's reproductive health. So now andrology does exist. It's still very small. Most people have never heard of it, especially in the US. In other countries, it is a little bit better known. So we have this world where we do have a lot of medical attention and medical knowledge and medical sort of advice for women about reproduction. But to this day, the lack of medical infrastructure, which is sort of most clearly seen in the lack of a specialty for men, means that men don't get the same advice and sort of knowledge base that women do.
Yeah, and then you follow a hypothetical man through his day in the book. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey that he goes on?
Yeah, so I sort of was trying to think about, as I was studying something that doesn't exist, right? The men's reproductive health. Certainly there are some urologists who focus on male fertility. There's some OBGYNs who will talk to their female patients about their male partner's health. But in general, there's so little attention to men's reproductive health. I was trying to think about how do you sort of tell a story about something that isn't there. And so I came up with an imaginary person who, of course, I gave the terribly generic name of John. And so John wakes up, and the story is that he, his eyes crack open and he sees this book on his nightstand of how to produce healthy sperm. And he takes a lukewarm shower so he doesn't cook his sperm, and he's changing his diet and the shampoo that he uses, all to avoid toxic exposures. And the idea was to say, wow, here's a world actually that women do live in when they are trying to get pregnant, and to follow all of the advice. What does that look like for men? And the way that story really emerged, and it is a fictional story that starts a very academic scholarly book with lots of data in it, but it does start out with a fictional story. The impetus for that was this relatively new body of research, which sort of has the umbrella term paternal effects. And paternal effects research shows that the age of a man's body and the health of his body and his exposures to toxins will not only affect things like sperm count or how well sperm swim, but that they can actually damage the genetics inside of sperm, potentially with consequences for his children. And so that's relatively new medical knowledge. I have done the interviews with the average American man, so I can say most American men have never heard this at all, because they're not seeing a doctor who's telling it to them. They're not sitting in a health class where they're hearing it. So I really wanted to sort of dive into what this new body of medical knowledge and figure out how to begin communicating that to men and the general public.
Yeah, so it's not that saying you are what you eat. Your children are what you eat, and then your children are what your sperm donor eats. So what are some of the consequences of there not being a specialist for men's reproductive health?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways that you can sort of think about that question. You could think about the consequences for individual men and individual couples who are trying to or interested in having children. So if men aren't getting basic advice about their age and The diet, the evidence on diet is not as strong as, say, the evidence on paternal age or paternal toxic exposures. But if they're not sort of thinking about what kinds of chemicals they're exposed to, then those couples are missing out on some amount of information that might help them make better decisions about reproductive health. So that's sort of the individual level. I think, I'm a sociologist, so I'll sort of span out to the societal level. And I think that as a society, if we are primarily issuing public health messages around women's reproductive health, then we are missing major opportunities to actually improve the health of men and potentially their children. And that's not something that just individuals can do. I can't wave my wand and say, every single individual in this country, go do a better job. We have to actually make investments as a society in public health and quality health care and clean air and clean water and healthy food and all the things that we know and we still don't do, unlike many, many other countries around the world. So I think to, sort of think about the lack of attention to men's reproductive health, not only as it affects individuals, but how it affects our policymaking as a society. And I think we have to sort of tackle both of those issues at the same time.
Yeah, that's so important. And then as far as your research, that also involves speaking to men about what they know about reproductive health. I'm so curious to see what you learned and discovered when doing that.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things to do as a sociologist is actually, so we do surveys, we do qualitative interviews, we go and observe people, we dig in the archives to do historical work, but I really do love sitting down with people and talking about, how do you think about your life and how do you describe your own experiences? And so in the sociological literature on reproduction, just like clinicians don't talk to men, sociologists don't talk to men. So we have decades of research now on reproduction that is mostly interviews with women about abortion and contraception and birth and pregnancy and all the things, but we rarely talk to men. So this was actually one of the first interview studies with men from the general public, right? So not men in fertility clinics, not men in sperm banks, but just your average men from the general public about questions. I asked questions like, how do you define a man's role in reproduction? What is that to you? How would you describe the relationship between an egg and a sperm? And so because it was one of the first studies to do this, I really had very few hypotheses about what it was that they were going to say. And so that made those interviews really interesting because every single one I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they said this or I can't believe they said that. But at the end of the day, the thing that I learned from talking with 40 men from all walks of life, less educated, more educated, there were men who were homeless or unemployed, men who were very financially successful, men who were fathers, men who were not, men who were white, men of color, right? So I had a lot of variety in my sample to try to get the lay of the land out there. And what I found was that even though men really didn't know what to say when I first asked them, what's a man's role in reproduction, they all sort of stumble around. It's like, oh, I've never thought about that before. Like, what is a man's role in reproduction? At the end of the day, they define it in a sort of a three-part role of having sex and providing sperm and being a dad. Right? Which is interesting because I think if you went and asked women, how would you define a woman's role in reproduction? I don't think a lot of women would say having sex or providing an egg, right? Unless they are actually having difficulty and need to provide an egg. But it makes sense because these are the ways that men's bodies are involved in reproduction, right? Is that they, they have sex and that they provide the sperm for fertilization. And so that was where, I sort of really then went on a deep dive into how do men think about their sperm. And I don't know how far you want me to go down that road, but I'm happy to talk more.
Obviously I could talk about this all day. And so this is so fascinating to me and this is super fun because I do the same kinds of things, but my survey groups are usually in elevators where I ask people who are in a confined space and I say things like, how many people here know that a woman can freeze her eggs? So I love what you do and what you're talking about. And what do people who are wanting to grow their family, what should they know about women's health and what to look for? Like how would you change the framework that guys work within when it comes to how they think about their roles if you were in charge of the world like that? Obviously there are a few people that know more than you about this, so What would you do if you were in charge of public policy?
Yeah, so I thought a lot about this question in writing, especially writing the conclusion of the book of sort of what's next, right? What comes out of a recommendation about the history of inattention to men's reproductive health. And so I think that there's a number of things that are fairly easy to do. And so one of them is to tackle the sort of lack of education at present that we provide men almost in any forum. So the men that I spoke to, like I said, had not really heard about paternal effects, were really interested in knowing more details about, okay, well, how many cigarettes is it until I really am sort of increasing the cancer risk for my children? Or what do I do about the pesticides that I work with, and I can't not work with pesticides, right? Or whatever it is. So they wanted more information, and they wanted detailed information. So first we need the scientists to do more and better research about what exactly the risk levels are that are associated with men's age and health and exposures. And then for men, many of them said they hadn't really heard anything about their own reproductive system since high school in a health class or a sex ed class. I think maybe there was one or two who had spoken to a doctor who had ever raised the question of his own reproductive health. So I think adding information about men's reproductive health to high school sex ed and health classes is going to be an easy way to capture them. I think running a general public health campaign, because men don't necessarily go to the doctor as often as women, they're not seeing specialists in men's reproductive health the way that women are. So I think a sort of generalized public health campaign is one way to do it. And then I think when it comes to reproductive health care providers, reproductive health as an umbrella is technically a gender neutral term, right? It has been synonymous with women's health. And now it's starting to stretch just a little to include transgender and gender non-binary people, right? So we're sort of thinking about reproductive health, not just women, but maybe trans, and talking about pregnant people and not just pregnant women, right? So I'd like to take that reproductive health umbrella and expand it even further to think about men's reproductive health, because there's already an infrastructure in place through places like Planned Parenthood and the VA and OBGYNs, right, who could raise these issues for the patients they're seeing, and to start thinking about not just the reproductive health of women's bodies, but the reproductive health of all bodies.
Right. I started throwing egg freezing parties in 2014. And I actually thought of throwing sperm freezing parties because my parties weren't about freezing eggs. My parties continue to just be about fertility education, and the term is just kind of gimmicky. So I actually did throw a sperm freezing party. I think it was maybe in like 2016 in October. That's the last one that I did, but perhaps we start classes and then we can go on a sperm freezing party campaign just for the education piece of it, because I think that your book will hopefully change the mind, not necessarily the minds, but I feel like the more people are aware of it, more people will be talking about it around the dinner table, and they'll realize how important the sperm quality is when it comes to making babies. It's not just a matter of, like, what I say is having a shot of tequila, going to a bar, having a shot and having sex and making a baby. We need to prepare a little bit more, and our society really depends and relies on healthy sperm.
Yeah, I would just say to that, the issue of preparing to have children, I completely agree with you. For people who are in a position to be thinking about that and to do that, but then there's this very robust statistic that 50% of all pregnancies in the United States are not planned, right? And so I think that at the same time, that's why I sort of talk about both the importance of educating people who are in a place to hear it and who have the financial resources to think about something like egg freezing or to think about planning to have children. There's a lot of people who don't necessarily sit down and pull out their calendar and say, okay, 3 months from now, I got to get my sperm in shape and da-da-da-da, right? And so that's why I think at the same time as we're both thinking in particular about reproductive health, if we think about increasing the general health of a population, that has all kinds of benefits beyond just people having children, but would also potentially improve people's bodily health for if and when they do have children.
Right. I mean, I have these ideas, but no one agrees with them or wants to, what's the word I'm trying to use? They want to implement my ideas. So one of them is like on birth control pill boxes, there should be a little card like, have you thought about your fertility? there are all these women who have these heartbreaking stories, 17 years old, they start birth control, they stop at 32 and they realize that they're out of eggs, right? And it's the same thing, maybe cigarette boxes. Like, is there a chance that you might be trying to have a baby in the next 3 months?
Right, right. And there are some countries I have, because I study sperm, have now studied sperm for almost 20 years. I get emails from all over. And there are some countries that do put warnings about sperm on cigarette boxes, right? And so that is something that we could think about. I mean, for more than 10 years, the epidemiologists, through their professional association, have been saying every single man who's thinking about conceiving a child should stop smoking because heavy smoking comes with a raised risk of cancer for their children, right? And that is just not a message that's getting to the general public because we don't have the proper megaphone, right? There's no Society of Men's Reproductive Health that has the sort of status and money to really make that message fully kind of get out. And I'm trying not to say disseminate, to fully head out into the world in the way that it needs to.
Right. So this is totally a random thought, but this last week, Joe Biden announced a campaign for, if a certain percentage got vaccinated, then there would be like free beer for everybody. And I was like, the sperm, that's what I'm thinking. I'm just curious. Did you have any thoughts as a sociologist about the public health impact of that messaging at all?
I didn't go there. I had the conversation with some of my colleagues about, okay, well, could this work? It was more like, how do we get those vaccination rates up? But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the interesting thing, and one of the things that I did for the book was that I did it wasn't a formal meta-analysis, but it was a pretty good look at the scientific research base, evidence base for paternal effects, sort of starting in the 1970s, when that literature really starts to pick up speed. And so, there's still a big question mark about alcohol. And so from working with sperm banks for research for my first book, they definitely know that alcohol, for sperm donors who were drinking too much, having too much fun the night before, and they come in and their sperm cells don't look as good, or the semen volume is down. So there is definitely short-term effects on alcohol, but the question of whether alcohol actually affects the genetics inside sperm, I think, is definitely still an open question. Things like paternal age, there's pretty good evidence that, increasing paternal age comes with an increased risk of both childhood conditions and some adult onset conditions for people's children. Like I said, smoking is one of those things that they definitely know. And then anytime you are studying environmental toxins or toxins in the home, in the workplace, it's incredibly difficult to specify the dose of just that particular exposure because we're all being exposed to so many things at the same time, right? So there's a lot of epidemiologists who will say, all right, we are pretty sure that toxins are not good for sperm, either the count or the shape or the swimmability. The motility is the formal term. They're pretty sure that these things are not good for sperm or the genetics inside of them, but it's hard to really get good risk numbers that you could give to an individual man.
Right, I agree. And I feel like if someone's, let's say, has other chronic medical problems, diabetes, for example, high blood pressure, then the alcohol clearly isn't going to help. But I definitely agree with you. So what do you think OBGYNs can do? You mentioned them being partners in this, public awareness campaign that I am theorizing that you're going to start as more people read your book. What can OBGYNs do, and doctors in general?
Yeah, so this was another thing that I have sort of, kind of thought about, like where in the medical system could we sort of, increase the level of attention. So OBGYNs are interesting because, of course, they are often seeing women who are thinking about reproduction, or they're asking questions about women's reproductive plans and either then recommending contraception or sort of, preconception or prenatal care. So OBGYNs, I think, are a natural place for physicians to sort of raise questions with their women patients. But of course, then this requires women to do the work of learning about men's reproductive health. So for those who are heterosexually partnered, they can pass that on to their husbands or their male partners. And that is sort of adding on more work for women, but would be a potential pathway, right? So I put my gender hat on and I was like, okay, I don't love the fact that women are already making the appointments and having to do the research and having to take care of their own bodies, and now they have to learn about their male partners. So if I put my gender hat on, that's my concern. But then at the same time, like logistically, women talking to OBGYNs is an obvious place to raise questions about men's reproductive health. Another place I think actually would be for pediatricians who are, in general seeing male patients who are 16, 17, 18 years old and could have a chat with them before they either go off to college or join the military, that last, physical they get before they turn 18 or 19. Pediatricians are often the last ones to be doing preventive healthcare with men until they walk in the door at age 50 for a colonoscopy. Right? And at that point, because they're not seeing anybody on a regular basis in between there. So internal medicine folks, if they have a man who's, between the ages of 20 and 50, could be asking questions at their checkup to say, okay, you're here for a wellness visit. Like, let's talk about your reproductive health as well. So I think there's a lot of places where you could sort of, add it to what I know is a very, very long list of things to discuss with patients. But because men aren't, going to the male version of an OBGYN every 2 years, that's why it sort of requires a little bit of creativity to think about where do you plug this kind of advice in.
Yeah, I mean, the name of your book, GUYnecology, obviously it's really easy to remember. You could have people go to your website, right, do a course. I mean, I'm just planting ideas.
That's a great idea. Yeah, no, I hadn't sort of thought about like, okay, I could provide continuing medical education of some sort.
Absolutely. An online course where people could sign up. The OBGYN could say, just go to gynecology.com. I really want you to learn more about male reproductive health.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I had not thought of that. I'm writing it down.
And there's been more attention given to male fertility in the last few years. Why do you think that is? Why a shift now?
This is another really good question. And, because I have studied first sperm donors and now men and reproductive health, and in particular sperm, I have been thinking about sort of male reproductive bodies professionally for about 20 years. And so I have also noticed that there has been sort of an uptick in the level of, the number of media stories, the sort of level of attention, people want to talk about it a little bit more. I don't have a good answer for like why, since 2015 or 2017.
So is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners today?
I think that one of the things, so I really appreciate you having me on today to talk about this issue of men's reproductive health, which I just think is so incredibly important. And obviously I've written an entire book about it. And so I think that this is something we should be talking about more. But I think one of the things that I want to make sure that people realize is just how interested men themselves were in learning this information. And I think that that's a question that has come up over the decades that, people have been trying to develop a male contraceptive pill. There's always this question of, well, are men going to be interested? But we live in a pretty dramatically changed world in the past 2 or 3 decades where gender norms have changed, our definitions of what constitutes family have changed. We are newly open to all kinds of family formations. And so the world looks really different. And I think our notions of who men are and how they think about reproduction and family also need to change. And so I just think that's a really important message that I want to just sort of underline as we talk about this sort of specific issue of men's reproductive health.
Awesome. And then can you share, I didn't ask you too much about it, but I have to tell you, I want you back on to talk about sex cells. But for people who don't know about that book, can you tell us a little bit about that book too, before we end today's interview?
Yeah, so my first book was a look at the market for egg donation and sperm donation in the United States. And so I went around to some of the oldest and largest sperm banks and some of the oldest and largest egg agencies. And I talked to staff about what makes a good donor and how do you decide who gets to be a donor. And then I interviewed donors themselves, so sperm donors and egg donors, about how did you decide to be a donor? How does it feel to have genetic genetically related children out there? What was the actual process of donating like for you? And so that was really a look at how, in some ways, egg donors and sperm donors are donating the exact same thing, right? They're each providing half of the genetic material you need to create an embryo, and yet they have very different understandings. There's very different technologies involved, very different bodily experiences, and very different thoughts about their relationship to the offspring that are all informed in part by sort of our ideas of gender and parenthood. So it's an earlier book, so it's about 10 years old now, and I haven't been in egg agencies and sperm banks for a while, so I'm sure things have changed somewhat, but I think, talking with the donors and hearing what they had to say, I think that still sort of really holds true to this day.
Yeah, I agree. And I would love to have you back on to talk about sex cells. So thank you for reading that book. Good. Well, thank you again, Renee, for all your work. And I'm so excited that I got to meet you today. Truly such a pleasure to have you on and an honor. So thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. It was such a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for all of the attention that you bring to these issues.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Abazadeh
And you have yet another success story.
just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.